During the year which preceded the discovery of the George plot, I had not once occasion to see General Moreau at the Tuileries. I have accordingly nothing to say about this general, whose peculiarities are, however, well known. I learned that he had rejected all the First Consul's advances and refused his numerous invitations. From the time of his marriage with Madame Hulot, to which Madame Bonaparte had contributed, his mother-in-law, a jealous and troublesome woman, did all she could to foment discord between these two rivals in military glory. Madame Hulot had complained of having to wait to be received by Madame Bonaparte when she called upon her, and said that she had no inclination at all for the antechamber of an equal. General Moreau used to speak with affected frivolity of the hostile attempts against the person of the First Consul or against the acts of his government. This coolness, in short, degenerated into an enmity, which led Moreau to contract an alliance unworthy of his glory with the enemies of the state, an alliance in which he found his death, wounded in the midst of the adversaries of France by a French cannonball. An interview which attracted but little attention at the time took place in the middle of 1802 between the Emperor of Russia and the King of Prussia at Meneval, the eastern port of the Prussian states. The latter sovereign had been reigning 5 years. The Emperor Alexander had just succeeded his father, the unfortunate Paul I, who had been assassinated 3 months previously in his St. Petersburg palace. These princes, both young men, desired to make the acquaintance of each other. The Emperor of Russia proposed a friendly meeting, which the king readily accepted. The Queen of Prussia, in all the splendor for youth and beauty, accompanied the king and contributed greatly to the close friendship which bound the two sovereigns together. The result of this friendship was that from thenceforward Prussia was attracted into Russia's sphere of action. The First Consul, anxious not to appear hostile to this meeting, although absent from it, and curious to know what would happen there, sent an officer of the palace, a shrewd observer, to attend. Major de Moustier, who afterwards became general, an officer of great distinction and of really antique virtue, was charged to convey the consul's compliments to the two kings. He carried a letter from the First Consul to the King of Prussia, which expressed Napoleon's satisfaction at the arrangement which had been concluded for the settlement of the indemnity due to Prussia by the provisions of the Treaty of Luneville, which had largely increased the territories of the King of Prussia. The indemnity of the Prince of Nassau Orange, the king's father-in-law, had been settled at the same time in accordance with his wishes. Large indemnities had been stipulated in favor of the houses of Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, which were united to the Russian imperial house by family ties. This news, coming at so favorable a moment, was received with great pleasure by the two princes and disposed the Emperor of Russia to join with the First Consul in the apportionment of the lands for the indemnification of the small kings who had been dispossessed on the left bank of the Rhine. This journey of the Emperor of Russia and of the King of Prussia, far from their capitals, was the prelude to those meetings of the monarchs of Germany and of the North, and of those nomadic congresses which became so frequent 12 years later. Another officer of the palace was sent at about the same time to Algiers on another kind of mission, in spite of the peace concluded with the Barbary states. The corsairs of the regencies, yielding to their habits of piracy, were recommencing their raids on our coasts, and had even dared to attack our flag. The First Consul sent a naval division before Algiers under the command of Admiral Lessegas. He was accompanied on board by Adjutant Ulan, who was commissioned to demand reparation for these insults and for the injuries caused to our trade from the day. The impression which Ulan's lofty nature, his martial attitude, and the richness of his embroideries made upon these savages completed what had been commenced by the First Consul's letter and the appearance of their French fleet. The Dey submitted on every point, released all prisoners of French or Allied nationality, and sent ambassador loaded with presents to Paris. I witnessed the last Republican celebration of the anniversary of the 14th of July at the Tuileries Palace. A grand parade took place that day in the Carousel Court, at which the first consul presented flags to the light infantry regiments, represented for the occasion by the colonel and 3 officers of each regiment. Just before the parade, the prefect of the Seine department, accompanied by 2 of the mayors of Paris, presented the first consul with a horse of the French breed, richly caparisoned. The diplomatic body was received in solemn audience. Strangers of distinction were presented by the ambassador or plenipotentiary ministers of their courts. Marriages were celebrated at the cost of the government in each of the 12 arrondissements of Paris. Banquets, illuminations, and fireworks crowned this fete. There was no ceremony at the Tuileries on the 14th July the following year. The first consul and Madame Bonaparte were away on a 3-week journey in the Seine Inférieure and Oise departments. On the same day in the year 1804, Napoleon, then emperor, rode to the Invalides through a line formed by the troops of the garrison, preceded by the marshals and the great officers of the empire, by the colonels of the guard, and by his aides-de-camp. The empress, accompanied by the sisters and sisters-in-law of the emperor, her ladies, her chamberlains, and her equerries, had preceded him at noon to the Invalides. A mass was celebrated by the cardinal legate. After the religious ceremony, a distribution of decorations took place, handed by Napoleon in person to each legionary, as he took them from the hands of the Grand Chancellor of the Order. A Te Deum terminated the ceremony. In the evening, all public buildings were illuminated. A concert was given on the terrace of the Tuileries Palace, and fireworks were displayed on the Pont Neuf. One night, during one of the first consul's stays at La Malmaison in 1802, he was awakened by a courier from Spain who brought some very urgent dispatches from General Lannes, French ambassador at Lisbon. As soon as Napoleon had read these dispatches, he gave orders that the courier should hold himself in readiness to start on the return journey at a moment's notice. I am obliged to go back in my story to explain what precedes. In the course of November 1801, General Lannes, who was sole commander of the consular guard, had been forced to resign in consequence of some irregularities which had occurred in the regimental treasury. This was the truth of the matter. The first consul had promised to pay the general's house furnishing expenses. When the bills were submitted to him, he refused to pay them, as they far exceeded what he had expected. General Lannes, who was accustomed to give and spend without counting, and had no idea at all of business, and who had never applied to Bonaparte in vain when want of money, considered that the first consul was so bound by the promise he had made that he could think of no better plan than to make him pay his furniture bills than to get the treasurer of the regiment of guards to hand him over the amount. Such conduct could not be tolerated, and General Lannes lost his command. The consular guard was reorganized more in accordance with its requirements, and the sole command, which had till then existed, was broken up to 4, each vested in a colonel general, to punish General Lannes for his unbusinesslike proceedings, and anxious to put a stop to a familiarity which had in some ways prompted him to act as he had done. The first consul sent him away for a time, ordering him on a mission to Lisbon. I remember dining with him about this time at Joseph Bonaparte's table and hearing with what sarcasm he betrayed his displeasure at the way in which he had been treated. Monsieur de Champagny, who had been appointed ambassador to Vienna, was present at this dinner. General Lannes, little acquainted as he was with diplomatic forms, did not at first succeed in his new post. The Portuguese ministry, and more especially the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dom João de Almeida, was devoted to England. All diplomatic documents handed in by the French ambassador were passed on to Lord Fitzgerald, the English ambassador, and the answers concocted with him. The Prince Regent of Portugal, either deceived or dominated by this minister, was also not favorably disposed towards the French representative. General Lannes soon felt his military pride, his self-esteem, and his patience flouted beyond endurance. Without warning either the Portuguese or his own government, he left Lisbon suddenly, giving orders to his household to follow him. He presented himself at the first posting establishment and demanded horses. The postmaster informs him that an order is necessary and that without it he must refuse to accommodate him. General Lannes imperiously orders him to have horses put to, and laying his hand on his sword, threatens to strike him unless his orders immediately obeyed. The postmaster is forced to submit. General Lannes crosses through Portugal and Spain post-haste, and just before arriving at Bayonne, sends his valet de chambre on with a letter to the first consul announcing his arrival. The valet, sent back with an answer to his letter, finds his master at Orleans. The first consul's orders were that the general should remain where the courier found him. He had calculated that General Lannes would not have passed Bayonne. Lannes, however, receiving this order at Orleans, thought himself justified from his proximity to Paris in pushing on to the capital. The first consul refused to receive him. In the meanwhile, the great anxiety was felt by the Portuguese government. It was a matter of importance that General Lannes' conduct should be disapproved of and that Portugal should not incur the resentment of France. The general had Talleyrand against him, and Talleyrand, insisting on the violation of diplomatic forms which had been committed, demanded the revocation of our ambassador to Lisbon. The first consul would not have tolerated such conduct from anybody else, but he knew that though General Lannes was no diplomat, he was an honest man who had too much judgment to allow himself to be made a dupe of. He finally agreed to see him, and was satisfied with his explanations, although he blamed his conduct. Don Juans scattered gold by handfuls in Paris to prevent the return of General Lannes to Lisbon. The Prince Regent, acting on information which had reached him, sent 2 men in whom he had confidence to Paris, and this without the knowledge of his minister. One of them was a Frenchman, whom I was acquainted with, who had been living in Portugal for many years, whilst Almeida was assuring the Prince Regent that General Lannes had fallen into complete disgrace. The prince's agents reported that a reconciliation had taken place, and that the ambassador had altogether been restored to the first consul's good graces. The Prince Regent then thought it right for something decisive had to be done to ask for his return, whilst the Portuguese ministers were flattering themselves that they would make good their escape from the scrape in which they had involved themselves. The first consul notified to the Prince Regent that he would consent to the return of his ambassador to Lisbon, and that he would forget the reasons for displeasure which the Portuguese government had given him, but that in return for this concession, he expected a concession on the prince's part, namely the dismissal of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, whose partiality for the English and whose bad faith had been the causes of what had happened. The Prince Regent was only too glad to accept this settlement of the affair. Don Juan de Almeida was dismissed, and General Lannes returned to Lisbon. His triumph was complete. The Prince Regent received him at first with a cordiality which was more affected than real, but growing to like him eventually became on terms of great intimacy with him. General Lannes, who had plenty of natural shrewdness, understood his position. The Portuguese nobility at that time, proud and poor, held aloof and hesitated to make the first advances. General Lannes gave a sumptuous ball and invited everybody whose names had been inscribed on the embassy register. He did the honors of this ball with all possible refinements, and nothing else was talked about in Lisbon. Those of the aristocracy who were not present complained at not having been invited. They were informed and answered that if the ambassador had thought that an invitation would have been agreeable to them, he would have sent it, and that he should be delighted and honored if they would call upon him. The hidalgos crowded to leave their names at his house. General Lannes gave another ball to which they were all invited. The invitations were accepted with eagerness, and from that time forward, the aristocracy frequented the French embassy. Thanks to his intimacy with the Prince Regent, the French envoyé was able to assist some of these needy noblemen. His credit at court was great, and his recommendations were always favorably listened to. The jurisdiction of his embassy accordingly was unlimited, nor did the Portuguese government in any way try to restrict it. No such tolerance was shown to the ambassadors of other powers. Our ambassador's influence in Lisbon was so well established that when he returned to France, he was in a position to dispose of Portugal as Napoleon might desire. It is calculated that the sum spent in Paris to prevent the return of General Lannes amounted to 4 million of francs. Where the greater part of this money went to can easily be guessed. When the general heard of this, he remarked jocularly, "What clumsy fellows! If they had only offered me half that amount, I wouldn't have gone back to Lisbon." Lisbon. And so it happened that the cause of France was better served by our ambassador's impetuous susceptibility than it would have been by the skill of the most consummate diplomat. The first consul understood better than his minister of foreign affairs to what advantage he could turn it. It is true that Napoleon, at least, saw everything in the light of national interest and in that light alone. It is so ordained here below that side by side with any success, there's always a jealous desire to diminish its merit. And so it was that when the money sacrifices made by the Portuguese ministers to prevent the return of General Land to Lisbon were heard of, it was stated, in face of the general's spontaneous exclamation, that Monsieur de Bonau, ambassador from Saxony to France, had been commissioned by him to carry a proposal to Monsieur de Souza, Portuguese ambassador to Paris. This proposal, it was said, was to effect that if 1,000,000 francs were given to the general, he would undertake to refuse to return to Lisbon in spite of any pressure from the first consul. This is what Madame de Souza, the wife of the Portuguese ambassador, told me on the subject. Madame de Souza, being one day at La Malmaison, met the first consul as he was going to Madame Bonaparte. He led her aside by the arm. "What does Monsieur de Souza mean?" he asked irritably. "By offering money to my ambassador to prevent his returning to Lisbon." Madame de Souza protested that, on the contrary, it was to Monsieur de Souza that the proposal was made. "And what is there to prove that?" said the first consul. "The treasury of the consular guard," cried Madame de Souza, her excitement getting the better of her reflection in allusion to the deficit in the accounts of this regiment when it was under General Land's command. The first consul, knowing the general's honesty, never said a word, but turned his back on Madame de Souza. Slightly disturbed by this silence and the tacit disapproval which the consul's manner implied, Madame de Souza went to Josephine and told her what had just passed between the first consul and herself. Josephine advised her to return to Paris at once, to shut herself up and not see anybody for 8 days, so that the first consul might see that she had communicated with nobody. Madame de Souza followed this advice, pretended to be ill, and took to her bed, refusing to receive anybody.